Good morning and welcome to World News here on TVP World. I'm your host, Diana Skaya. And we begin this morning with the latest updates from Ukraine. Talks on Ukraine in Paris were excellent and signal that Europeans are once again back at the negotiating table when it comes to Kyiv's future. That's according to the French foreign minister following a meeting between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, President Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff, and European and Ukrainian officials. Following those talks, Rubio spoke to reporters at the airport about his thoughts on the future of the war. And for more on that, let's go to our correspondent, Oz Chatterjee, who is coming to us live from Kyiv. Good morning, Oz. Now, I really want to ask you this. I mean, here we have Marco Rubio reiterating that, quote, "We came here yesterday to sort of begin to talk about more specific outlines of what it might take to end the war, to try and figure it out. And I'm talking about a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, whether or not this is a war that can be ended." I mean, Oz, didn't Donald Trump throughout his entire campaign repeatedly promise that he would actually be able to end this war in 24 hours? I mean, how can we, what are reactions to this?
Well, I think it's also important to note that the French interpretation of the events, of the meetings as excellent, are not matching up with the statement from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who implies that the U.S. is ready to walk away from the process should they have no tangible progress made in the next few days, he said, not weeks. Let's take a listen to some of his comments that he gave earlier on.
We are now reaching a point where we need to decide and determine whether this is even possible or not, which is why we're engaging both sides. As you know, Ambassador Witkoff has had not one, not two, but 3 meetings with Vladimir Putin to determine the Russian perspective on this and understand what it would take for them to end it. We, through General Kellogg, myself and others, have had repeated engagements with the Ukrainians. So we came here yesterday to sort of begin to talk about more specific outlines of what it might take to end a war, to try to figure out very soon, and I'm talking about a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, whether or not this is the war that can be ended. If it can, we're prepared to do whatever we can to facilitate that and make sure that it happens, that it ends in a durable and just way. If it's not possible, if we're so far apart that this is not going to happen, then I think the president's probably at a point where he's going to say, well, we're done. You know, we'll do what we can on the margins. We'll be ready to help whenever you're ready to have peace. But we're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end.
So there's also some talk there that Marco Rubio gave, not in that specific quote, talking about European sanctions on Russia, saying that the US doesn't have control over those sanctions and that those sanctions would need to be part of any peace process. Very much sounds like the Russians are insisting that the Europeans lift any sanctions before they agree to any deal. However, this talk about the US being willing to walk away is not necessarily good news for Ukraine. It's not that they're saying that they're willing to walk away from the talks and continue to support Ukraine. It sounds like they're preparing themselves for a situation in which the US washes its hands off the entire situation and leaves it to the Europeans. So this, while it might sound like some growing frustration with Russia about this, with these proposals to lift European sanctions being sent back to the Ukrainians, it actually sounds like, again, more US pressure being brought to bear on the Ukrainian side to accept whatever is on offer, whatever the Russians are offering, instead of trying to find concessions that the Russians are willing to make. There's still no talk of any concessions that Russia would have to make in these deals. So, and this talk of European sanctions being lifted from Russia is going to be a complete non-starter, not just to the Ukrainians, but obviously to the Europeans too. So look, the Trump administration growing increasingly frustrated with their failing attempts to end the war here in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Oz Chatterjee. Many developments on that front, and we will be coming back to you for more. Coming to us from Kyiv. 1 person was killed and 57 wounded in a Russian strike on the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. Ukrainian authorities say that the Russians used a ballistic missile armed with cluster munitions in the attack. Now, it's been reported that 20 residential blocks, 30 houses, and an educational facility were damaged in the massive fire during the raid on Kharkiv. In nearby Sumy, a drone strike killed one person and injured another. And in Ukraine's southern Kherson region, Russian attacks killed 4 people and injured 25 in the span of the last 24 hours, according to the Kherson Regional Military Administration. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy announced that Ukraine has agreed to the outline of the minerals deal with the United States, though the agreement is yet to be finalized. Zelenskyy also said that ceasefire talks are underway, stressing that Ukraine will never recognize any of its temporarily occupied territories as Russian.
The memorandum of intent, not the agreement itself, the memorandum of intent can be signed online today. Exactly today, our side said OK, and now they are with the American side. I understand that they are now, the Vice Prime Minister, Ola Stefanishnaya, is working with the American side on the text. As I told you, today we are discussing an unconditional ceasefire, and until the ceasefire, we will not discuss territorial matters. You know my attitude and what our red lines are. We will never recognize any of our temporarily occupied territories, Ukrainian lands, as Russian.
In an interview for TVP World, Scott Lucas from University College Dublin said that Donald Trump's administration has dropped its asking price on the mineral deal with Ukraine, making it more feasible for Kyiv.
It appears that the negotiations have gotten to the point where the Americans are only asking for $100 billion to be repaid, which is still a large number, but not as large as $300 billion. And it looks like there are commitments that some of the profits can be used for Ukrainian recovery. That's why Kyiv is saying that they think they're moving towards a deal that they can sign. Donald Trump, just a few minutes ago, in his press conference alongside the Italian leader, Giorgia Meloni, said that he expects that deal to be signed next Thursday. Well, Trump says a lot of things we can't trust, but it does indicate that there may be the conclusion of this deal finally by the end of next week.
U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance is set to arrive in Rome on Good Friday on a visit aimed at deepening ties between the United States and Italy. Now, the trip may also present an opportunity for a public reconciliation with Pope Francis following tensions over immigration policy earlier this year. Now, in the Italian capital, Vance is scheduled to meet with Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, as well as the Vatican Secretary of State, to discuss bilateral relations. According to sources familiar with the visit, Vance is also hoping for a brief encounter with the pontiff, which could become the focal point of his visit. Now, just days after taking office, Vance sparked controversy by suggesting in a television interview that financial motivations were behind the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' Advocacy for Migrants and Refugees. In response, Pope Francis issued a letter to American bishops firmly rejecting the allegations. After discussions with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, who visited the U.S. on Friday, Trump expressed confidence that a trade deal with the EU would be reached before the conclusion of the 90-day pause on tariffs.
Oh, there'll be a trade deal, 100%. Oh, well, you think there won't be? Of course there'll be a trade deal, very much. They want to make one very much, and we're going to make a trade deal. I fully expect it, but it'll be a fair deal.
Are they on your priority list?
Everybody's on my priority list.
I'm sure we can make a deal, and I'm here to help on that. I cannot deal in the name of the European Union. My goal would be invite the President Trump to pay an official visit to Italy and understand if there's a possibility when he comes to organize also such a meeting with Europe. For I think the best way is that we simply speak frankly about the needs that every one of us has and find ourselves in the middle. For that's useful for all.
In the United States, a whistleblower claims that Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency may have been responsible for a major cybersecurity breach. Now, according to the testimony of Daniel Berulis, an IT worker at the National Labor Relations Board, an IP address registered in Russia tried to access sensitive databases after Dodge staffers were given sweeping access to the board's systems. Berulis claimed that early last month, part of the system had been tampered with and about 10 gigabytes worth of data removed from the network. Scores of Russians with links to the Kremlin have reportedly been given passports by Serbia since the start of the war in Ukraine. Now, the investigative news outlet iStories claims that 204 Russians were handed Serbian citizenship between early 2022 and April 2025. Among those naturalized as Serbian citizens are 11 current and former executives of sanctioned Russian defense firms and their family members. iStories says 9 of those given Serbian passports were linked to sanctioned banks, including Gazprom Bank and VTB. Political party leaders in Canada discussed support for Ukraine, security threats, and U.S. tariffs during a debate ahead of the general election on April 28th. Now, during the debate, Canadian Prime Minister and Liberal Party leader Mark Carney proposed diversifying the country's trade partnerships and a robust response to the U.S. tariffs. Polls show that the ruling Liberals ahead of the Conservatives. Carney, who has led the central banks of both Canada and England, says his experience in handling crises make him the best candidate to deal with U.S. President Donald Trump, who has said he wants to annex Canada. The son of a police officer has opened fire with her mother's former service weapon at Florida State University, killing 2 people and injuring 6 others.
The 20-year-old son of a veteran Florida's Leon County police officer opened fire Thursday at Florida State University with his mother's former service weapon, killing 2 men and wounding at least 6 others. Officers quickly arrived and shot and wounded the shooter after he refused to comply with commands.
2 victims are deceased, and 5 individuals have been transported to a local hospital with gunshot wounds. The shooter has also been transported to a local hospital. The 2 deceased are not students. The shooter is believed to be a current FSU student.
U.S. President Donald Trump described the shooting as terrible and said he had an obligation to protect the Second Amendment when asked if he saw a need for gun reform.
Look, I'm a big advocate of the Second Amendment. I have been from the beginning. I protected it. And these things are terrible. But the gun doesn't do the shooting. The people do. It's, a phrase that's used probably too often. I will tell you that it's a shame. I'm just hearing about it now.
Mass shootings on U.S. school campuses have become recurring tragedies in recent years. The motive for Thursday's shooting remains unclear.
The U.S. has launched a massive strike on a fuel port in western Yemen. The attack left at least 38 people dead and 102 wounded. Now, footage released by Houthi-run media shows destroyed cars, burning fuel tanks, as well as Red Crescent personnel removing a body bag from the site. According to U.S. Central Command, the aim of the strike on the port was to cut off a source of fuel for Houthi militants. Thursday's attack was one of the deadliest since the United States launched airstrikes against the Iran-backed Houthis in its biggest military operation in the Middle East since President Trump took office in January. And that's all for this edition of World News here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching and stay with us for more news and features.